Welcome to The Bark Covered House, Chapter 11. And William Nolan is going to describe to us interactions here with Native Americans in the early 19th century Michigan. So, Chapter 11, the Indians visit us, their strange and particular ways. Some 3 or 4 years after we came to the country there, came a tribe or a part of a tribe of Indians and camped a little over a mile southwest of our house, in the timber, near the head of the windfall, next to the openings. They somewhat alarmed us, but Father said, "Use them well, be kind to them, and they will not harm us." I suppose they came to hunt. It was in the summertime, and the first we knew of them, my little brother and 2 sisters had been on the opening, picking huckleberries, not thinking of Indians. When they started home and got into the edge of the woods, they were in plain sight of Indians, and they said it appeared as if the woods were full of them. They stood for a minute and saw the Indians were peeling bark and making wigwams, and they had some trees already peeled. They said they saw one Indian who had a sort of a crown or wreath with feathers in it that waved a foot above his head, and they saw him mount a sorrel pony. As he did so, the other Indians whooped and hooted, I suppose to cheer the chief. Childlike, they were scared and thought that he was coming after them on horseback. They left the trail and ran right into the brush and woods from home. When they thought they were out of sight of the Indian, they turned towards home. After they came in sight of home, to encourage his sister, my little brother told them he wouldn't be afraid of any one Indian, but he said there were so many there that it was enough to scare anybody. When they got within 20 yards of the house, they saw someone coming beyond the house with a gun on his shoulder. And one said it was William Beale, and the other one said it was an Indian. They looked again and all agreed that it was an Indian. If they had come straight down the lane, they would have just about met him at the bars, opposite the house, where we went through. There was no way for them to get into the house and shun him except to climb the fence and run across the field, and the dreaded Indians seemed to meet them everywhere. If possible, they were more scared now than before. Brother and Sister Sarah were over the fence very quickly. Bessie had run so hard to get home and was so scared that in attempting to climb the fence, she got partway up and fell back, but up and tried again. Sister Sarah would not leave her, but helped her over. But John S. left them and ran for his life to the house. As soon as they could to get started, they ran too. Mother said Smith ran into the house looking very scared and went for the gun. And she asked him what was the matter and what he wanted the gun for. And he said there was an Indian coming to kill them and he wanted to shoot him. Mother told him to let the gun alone. The Indian would not hurt them. By this time my sisters had got in. In a minute or two afterwards the Indian came in, little thinking how near he had come to being shot by a youthful hero. Poor Indian wanted to borrow a large brass kettle that Mother had and leave his rifle as security for it. My mother lent him the kettle, and he went away, and in a few days he brought the kettle home. A short time after this, a number of them had been out to Dearbornville and got some whiskey. All but one had imbibed rather too freely of white man's firewater to make Indian feel good. They came down as far as our house, and as we had no stick standing across the door, they walked in very quietly without knocking. The practice or law among the Indians is, when one goes away from his wigwam, if he puts a stick across the entrance, all are forbidden to enter there. And as it is the only protection of his wigwam, no Indian honorably violates it. There were 10 of these Indians. Mother was washing. She said the children were very much afraid, not having gotten over their fright. They got all around her and the wash tub as though she could protect them. The Indians asked for bread and milk, and Mother gave them all she had. They got upon the floor and took hold of hands and formed a ring. The sober one sat in the middle, and the others seemed to hear what he said as much as though he had been an officer. He would not drink a drop of whiskey, but kept perfectly sober. They seemed to have a very joyful time. They danced and sang their wild songs of the forest. Then asked Mother for more bread and milk, and she told them she had no more. And then they asked for buttermilk, and she gave them what she had of that. As Mother was afraid, she gave them anything she had that they called for. They asked her for whiskey, and she said she hadn't got it. They said, "Maybe you lie." And then they pointed toward Mr. Pardee's and said, "Neighbor got whiskey?" And she told them she didn't know. And they said again, "Maybe you lie." When they were ready, the sober one said, "Indian, go." And he had them all start in single file. And in that way they went out of sight. Mother was overjoyed and much relieved when they were gone. They had eaten up all her bread and used up all her milk, but I suppose they thought they had had a good time. Not more than 2 or 3 weeks later, after this, the Indians moved away, and these children of the forest wandered to other hunting grounds. We were very much pleased, as the other neighbors, when they were gone. Father had a good opinion of the Indians, though he had been frightened by the first one, John Williams, and was afraid of losing his life by him. He considered him an exception, a wicked, ugly Indian. Thought perhaps he had been driven away from his own tribe and was like Cain, a vagabond upon the face of the earth. He was different from other Indians, as some of them had the most sensitive emotions of humanity. If you did them a kindness, they would never forget it, and they never would betray a friend. But if you offended them or did them any injury, they would never forget that either. These two traits of character run in parallel with their lives and only terminate with their existence. I recollect Father relating a circumstance that happened in the state of New York about the time of the Revolutionary War. He said an Indian went into a tavern and asked the landlord if he would give him something to eat. And the landlord repulsed him with scorn and told him that he would not give him anything and to get out of the house, for he didn't want any dirty Indians around. There was a gentleman sitting in the room who saw the Indian come in and heard what was said. The Indian started to go, but the gentleman stepped up and said, "Call him back. Give him what he wants. I'll pay for it." The Indian went back and had a good meal and was well used, and then he went on his way, and the gentleman saw him no more at that time. After this, the gentleman emigrated to the West and was one of the advanced guards of civilization. He went into the woods and built him a house and cleared a piece of land. About this time there was a war in the country. He was taken captive and carried away a long distance to an Indian settlement. He was tried by them for his life, condemned to death, and was to be executed the next morning. He was securely bound and fastened. The chief detailed an Indian who, he thought, knew something of the whites and their tricks and would be capable of guarding the captive safely. And he was set as a watch to keep him secure until morning. I have forgotten what Father said was to have been the manner of his execution, whether he was to be tomahawked or burnt. In all events, he was to meet his fate in the morning. Late in the night, after the warriors were fast asleep and perhaps dreaming of their spoils, when everything was still in camp, the Indian untied and loosed the captive and told him to be careful and still and to follow him. After they were outside the camp, out of hearing, the Indian told the white man that he was going to save his life and show him the way home. They traveled until morning, and all that day, and the night following, and the next morning they came in sight of a clearing, and the Indian showed him a house and asked him if he knew the place, and he said he did. Then the Indian asked him if he knew him. He told him that he did not. And then he referred him to the tavern and asked him if he remembered giving an Indian something to eat, and he said he did. "I am the one," said the Indian, "and I dare not go back to my own tribe. They will kill me." Here the friends parted to meet no more. One went home to friends and civilization, and the other one went an exile without friends, to whom he dared go with no home, a fugitive in the wilderness. There was a man by the name of H. Moody who often visited Father's house. He told me when he was young he was among the Mohawk Indians in Canada. This tribe formerly lived in what was now the state of New York. They took up on the side of the English and were driven away to Canada, and there settled on the Grand River. Mr. Moody was well acquainted with the sons of the great chief Bryant, and knew the laws and customs of the tribe. He said when they considered one of their tribes very bad, they set him aside and would have nothing to do with him. If one murdered another of the same tribe, he was taken up and tried by a council, and if it was found to be willful murder without any cause, he was condemned and put to death. But if there were any extenuating circumstances which showed that he had some reason for it, he was condemned and sentenced by the chief to sit on the grave of his victim for a certain length of time. That was his only hope, his city of refuge. If any of the relatives of the deceased wanted to kill him there, they had a right, according to their law, to do so. If he remained and lived his time out on that horrible place, he was received back again into the fellowship of his tribe. This must have been a terrible punishment. It showed, however, the Indian's love of his tribe and country to sit there and think of the danger of being shot or tomahawked and of the terrible deed he had committed. He had taken away what he could never give. How different was his case from one who left tribe, friends, and home and ran away to save the life of a white man who'd given him bread. About 2.5 miles southwest of our house, there was a large sand hill. Huckleberries grew there in abundance. I went there and picked some myself. On the top of that hill we found Indian graves, where some had been recently buried. There were pens built of old logs and poles around them, and we called it the Indian Hill, and it is known by that name to this day. The old telegraph road runs right around under the brow of this hill. This hill is in the town of Taylor. I don't suppose there are many in that town who do not know the hill or have heard of it, but few in the town of Dearborn. I don't suppose there are 6 persons living who know the reason it is called the Indian Hill, for we named it that very early day. Some 12 or 15 years after this, a man by the name of Clark, who had the job of grading down a sandy hill nearly a mile south of Taylor Center. And in grading, he had cut down the bank 6 or 7 feet to draw it off onto the road. He hired me with a team to go and help him. I went. He had been at work there before and shown me some Indian bones that he'd dug up and lain in a heap. He said that 2 persons were buried there. From the bones, one must have been very large and the other one smaller. He'd been very careful to gather them up, and he said that he thought they were buried in a sitting or reclining posture as he came to the skulls first. The skulls, arm, and thigh bones were in the best state of preservation. In fact, the most that was left of them. I took one thigh bone that was whole, sat down on the bank, and compared it with my own. As I was 6 feet, 1.5 inches, I tried to measure the best I could to learn the size of the Indian. We made up our minds that he was at least 7 or 7.5 feet tall. I think it likely it was his squaw who sat by his side. They must have been buried a very long time. We dug a hole on the north side of a little black oak tree that stood on the hill west of the road, and there we deposited all that remains of those ancient people. I was along there the other day, 1875, and as I passed I noticed the oak. It is now quite a large tree, and I thought there was no one living in this country but me who knew what lay beneath its roots. No doubt that Indian was a hunter and a warrior in his day. He might have heard and been alarmed that the white man had come in big canoes over the great waters and that they were stopping to live beyond the mountains. But little did he think that in a few moons, or skeezicks, as they called it, he would pass to the happy hunting ground and his bones be dug up by the white man, and hundreds and thousands pass over the place, not knowing that once a Native American and his squaw were buried there. That Indian might have sung this sentiment: "And when this life shall end, when calls the great Sowanan, Southwestern shall I wend to roam the great savannah, by Bishop. No doubt he was an observer of nature, and in his day he had listened to the voice of Gitche Mantu, or the Great Spirit, in the thunder, and witnessed the display of his power in the lightning as it destroyed the monster oak and tore it to slivers from top to bottom, and the voice of the wind all told him that there was a Great Spirit. It told him if Indian was good, he would go to a better place, where game would be plenty and no one would drive him away. No doubt he made preparation for his departure and wanted his bow and arrow and maybe other things buried with him. And if this was so, they disappeared, as we found nothing of the kind. It is known to be the belief of the Indian in his wild state that he will need his bow and arrow, or his gun and powder horn, or whatever he has to hunt with, to use after life has passed over to the happy hunting ground. About the time that Clark dug up the bones, I became acquainted with something that I could never account for and has always been a mystery to me. An Englishman was digging a ditch on the creek bottom to drain the creek a little over 3/4 of a mile west of Father's house. He was digging it 6 feet wide and 2 feet deep, where the brush called gray willows stood so thick that it was impossible for a man to walk through them. He cut the brush and had dug 8 or 10 inches when he came to red earth. Some day there had been a great fire at this place. The streak of red ground was about an inch thick, and in it he found what all called human bones. I went to see it myself, and the bones were gathered up were mostly small pieces, no whole ones, but we saw enough to convince us that they were human bones. The ground was burnt over, might have been, from the appearance, 12 feet square. It must have been done a great many years before, for the ground to make and the brush to grow over it. This creek, the E-course, not being fed by any rivulets or springs from hills or mountains, is supplied entirely by surface water. It is sometimes quite a large stream, but during the dry weather in the summertime it is entirely dry. The Englishman was digging it deeper to take off the surface water when it came. It is possible that sometimes Indians had burned their captives there. In fact, there's no doubt of it. It must have been the work of Indians. We may go back in our imaginations to the time when the place where the city of Detroit now stands was an Indian town or village, and ask its inhabitants if they knew who were burnt 12 miles west of there on the creek. They might not be able to tell. We might ask the giant Indian of the sandhill if he knew, and he might say, I had a hand in it, it was in my day. But we have no medium through which we can find out the dark mysteries of the past. They will have to remain until the light of eternity dawns, and all the dead who have ever lived are called to be again, and to come forth. And then the dark mysteries of the past, which have been locked up for centuries, will be revealed. What an amazing chapter! Reading about what this man thought of Native Americans from the time span of, say, 1875 or so when he's writing this. Thinking back on his childhood, his interaction with Native Americans, what he'd heard about Native Americans in the time period, maybe when he was a child, and then later on what's happening with Native Americans. And this all kind of comes together in a strange mishmash, and then some weird philosophy ideas in there. Still, very interesting chapter, and it's so easy for us to think about how people in the 18th century and 19th century, or even today, think about Native Americans as very much a monolithic body when they're not that at all. And I think this chapter really points to that in some ways. Really interesting chapter. Hope you're enjoying The Bark Covered House. It's a book that so much to learn from. So I'm really enjoying going back through it. Thank you so much. Hope you're having a great day, and thanks for watching.